So I'm really excited to be speaking today. Before we get started into the technical side of things, I want to tell a little bit of a story. Um, so I actually began my transition to React Native not very happy about React Native. I was not, I didn't want it in our application at the time. And I want to talk about the transition I had between being really not excited for React Native to the point now where I'm very excited for it. And in order to do that, I want to go way back in time to actually slightly before I started working at Artsy, to February 2014. I wrote this blog post. It was titled "We Need to Replace Objective C," and at the time, it got a lot of people weren't very happy about it. They didn't like this blog post. There were a lot of people who thought Objective C was great and thought that this is the way that Apple wants us to be building applications. So this is what we should continue to use to build applications. And I gathered a couple critiques of the language and the runtime and everything, put them in this blog post, and then a few months later, Swift was announced, which was really exciting to me. I really wanted Swift to work. So right before Swift was announced, I joined Artsy, and the mobile team and the web team in 2014. These were two parts of Artsy's engineering team. So the mobile team had 3 engineers, and we worked in Objective C to write the application, and Ruby because we contributed a lot to CocoaPods. The web team had about 7 engineers, and their backend was written in Ruby on Rails. Their front end was written in CoffeeScript and Backbone. And the way that software was written at Artsy was that when we would build a new feature, we would build it on the web first, and then the mobile application would follow later on with a native implementation, maybe. We didn't always actually complete all that work. We were always playing catch up to the web. Um, and we knew this, and we built technology to accommodate this. This was our culture, and we supported the culture with technology. And that's a really key theme that I'd like you to keep in mind as we go forward today, is how the culture that you decide on is supported by the technology that you build. So I want to talk a little bit about the application as it existed when I joined the company. The app is totally open source right now. It wasn't when I joined, but it was open source during my time here. And it has some really interesting architectural decisions. So the first is it's a hybrid application. It actually uses web views as well as native views. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because it's really important understanding how we continue to build software. Second, we use URL-based routing, which is also kind of interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It used stack views. Years before UI stack view was released by Apple, we actually built an open source stack view in order to build our user interfaces. So you would have like vertical stacks and side horizontal stacks, and it worked well to take like an iPhone user interface and scale it up to iPad. The application was really well tested, which was unusual for 2014 in iOS applications. Our web team really believed in unit testing, and that culture translated onto our mobile team as well. We followed a lot of really great Cocoa Touch design patterns. Networking was mostly great. We used AF networking. The application had been out for a year when I joined in 2014, and it had already accumulated some technical debt, if you can believe it. So now to go into a little bit of detail about what the application codebase looked like. I said earlier that we used URL-based routing, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So whenever a user tapped a button, or if the user wanted to look at an artist, say, they tap the artist name, we need to get them to the artist view controller. So the button would ask for a route. It would say like /artist/Banksy, say, and we give that to our router. And the router had all the different URL patterns that we could handle up front, and it would find the first one that matched and return you a view controller. And you would either present that modally or push it onto a navigation stack. But you didn't really know what was in the view controller. You just knew it was a view controller. This URL-based routing was new to me, and it's actually borrowed from Rails, but it worked really well because all of our push notification handling used the same URL structure. So all that was already built for us. deep linking from the web. If you're in Safari and you tap open in the app, it just works. If you're looking in Mail and you tap an Artsy link that the application supports, it uses the same routing logic. So that was pretty cool. There were some limitations to this. We didn't use the delegation pattern as much because you didn't know what the view controller was that you got back. So it was very difficult to assign yourself as a delegate to things. But we would always work around that either with Notification Center when we had to. But most of the time, we're just displaying content. So when you're pushing on a new view controller, you didn't really have to worry about what it was. So that was nice. The other thing we did was a hybrid application approach. So if you're looking at a native view controller and you tap onto something, you're getting back a view controller to present, and that might be a web view controller. If the router looks through all of its patterns and doesn't find a native view controller that can display that content, then it returns a web view controller instead. And this is kind of clever, but we inject a little bit of JavaScript into the web view to authenticate the user. So anything they do in that web view, they do as a logged in user into the site. We modified some settings like the deceleration rate and do some fancy things with loading to make it feel like a native view controller. And our app and our website use the same design language, so they already looked really similar. This might not work for everyone, but it worked really well for us. The really nice thing is that we could intercept when a user clicked a link in the web view, run that link through the router again, and then get back a native view. So we avoided this problem where they would get stuck in a web view loop. So this worked really well, and continues to work really well. This is supported. So a few months after I joined, Swift was announced, and I was super excited. I was there at WWDC when it was announced, and I wanted Swift so bad. I had written that blog post, and here it was. Yeah, I really wanted Swift to be how everyone built software in iOS, and that ended up blinding me to some of its costs, actually. So as excited as I was, maybe I was a little too excited. Um, yeah, a couple months after Swift was announced, we had to build a new project at Artsy. There was a desire to build an auction kiosk. So we would have iPads installed at auctions, and users would be able to look at the different artworks for sale and swipe a credit card and bid on those lots and everything. And I wanted to build it in Swift. And we really used this as like a way to test Swift. Like, we used not just Swift, but storyboards and the latest and greatest technology that UIKit had to offer. We used something called functional reactive programming. This was the first like major application that I built at Artsy, and we did it in Swift, starting at beta 2 or 3. It was very painful and probably would have been a mistake. But yeah, this is what it looked like. This was the first application that we built in the open. We had some closed source software that we've since open sourced, but this is the first app that we built in the open from day one. And that it was pretty cool to have like a new application built in a new programming language and be able to point people towards it. And this is what it looked like at an actual auction event. So yeah, fast forward to 2016. I had been building software in Swift at Artsy for a while, and I really wanted it to work. I pushed to add Swift to Eigen, which is our main art collector application. I kind of insisted on it, actually. Not everyone was excited about this. We had some people who were still learning Objective-C when they joined the company, who were contributing to our application. And now all of a sudden I was asking them to learn another programming language. And that really introduced a big barrier to entry. And this was about the time that we open sourced Eigen as well. So anyone would be able to see our work. Later that year, kind of still early in 2016, we decided to put React Native in our application. We had already experimented with some test apps the previous year, and we were convinced that, some of us were convinced that React Native was a good idea. We didn't have any immediate plans for supporting Android, the cross-platform opportunity was really interesting to us, but it was uh, it was not really like why we chose React Native. And in fact, we still don't have an Android application together. We don't have an Android application. So why did we use React Native? There's two reasons. The first is cultural. The mobile and the web teams were totally separate, and the mobile team was always playing catch up to the web team. That's a really frustrating place to be in. It's not, it doesn't feel good to always be behind another team at your company. So React Native was a desire to bring our teams closer together. We would have React Native on iOS, and we would have React on the web. Um, the uh, the other reason was React Native just seemed like a better way to build software, um, and I'll get to into that in a second. We discussed it as a team. I objected. I didn't really want to do this, but most people were on board with it, and it seemed like this was going to happen no matter what. The one thing that I really am proud of, and glad that we did at the time, was that we made a commitment that the user experience of our application would never be sacrificed for the sake of React Native. Where we had to, we would continue to use Objective-C and Swift in order to provide a really great user experience. We didn't want this to feel like a worse app because we had built it in React Native. So what do I mean by React Native is a better app? Let's talk about this briefly. Swift was a new approach to building software in an old way. You were still using view controllers, you were still using MVC, you were still using delegation. And that's changed a bit, I suppose, in the time since then. But like it's still just new syntax for an existing way to do things. And I know that Swift UI exists, but we're talking about 2016. This Swift UI was not around. In contrast, React Native was a totally new and better way of building software. And so what does that mean? What do I mean by building a better way of building software? The thing is that most applications are really only they're a user interface for an API. So you get an API response back and you present some user interface to represent that data. And if the user taps something, then you send an API call in order to make that change. If they follow an artist, then you call the follow artist API. It's a really thin layer around an API. And I say most apps, I probably say like 90% of apps that aren't games kind of do this. If you have a website and the website needs an application, then it probably falls into this category. And React is actually a really great way to build this type of app, whether it's on the web or mobile. So we created a new repository called Emission. We didn't want to force everyone building iOS software to use React Native. So in order to do that, we isolated the JavaScript and the React Native into one repository, and then no one would have to know about that unless they were working in it. So I was able to continue working in the iOS application without knowing about JavaScript at all. And this was a pretty helpful approach. So what does this look like in practice? We had Eigen, which was the main application, and I mentioned earlier that we used CocoaPods. So Emission itself was a CocoaPod, and the thing that it provided us was a set of view controllers. So Eigen pointed to Emission in a pod file, and then the router actually used all of those view controllers from Emission. So going back to our router, this is what that looked like. You would still ask for a URL, and it would give you back the first view controller that matched all of its patterns. And if that view controller happened to use JavaScript under the hood, that's fine. You don't know what the view controller does. Like we really set this up to support our existing technology because we didn't want to like rewrite the application in React Native. We wanted to add to it incrementally. So the inbox was one of the first things that we added, and we did it in React Native. And there's just a few other things I want to talk about first, and then I'm curious to hear what people have to say. So JavaScript itself, I mean, there are parts of it that I like, but there's a lot of parts of JavaScript that I don't like, especially when you're writing a web application. JavaScript is great, but if you're writing a mobile application that can crash all of a sudden and users get mad at you, you don't want JavaScript. You want something that provides some guarantees, some compile time guarantees, and that's not JavaScript. So we explored two options. First, we looked at Flow, which the React Native team recommended, and it added compile time safety to JavaScript. But the problem is that Flow is written in this really weird programming language called OCaml, and we wanted to be able to contribute to our tools. So instead, we went with TypeScript because TypeScript, the compiler itself is written in TypeScript. So by learning TypeScript to build React Native, we were also able to contribute to the application. And we actually have. We've submitted pull requests to the TypeScript compiler. Also, one of my colleagues actually left Artsy a few years ago and went to go work on the compiler at Microsoft. So I guess it worked out really well. And whenever I have like a compiler bug, I can message him and get it looked at. So yeah, are there any questions in the chat or anything I can clarify so far, Vladimir?
No, not yet.
From the chat. However, we can discuss this language peak. So basically, there in web development, there are people who thinks that vanilla JavaScript and so on should be the favorite language. Somebody is using Flow, right, from Facebook, and somebody is doing TypeScript. So can you please elaborate on the exact reason why you went exactly TypeScript and not anything else, not Flow, not vanilla JS?
Sure. So we went with TypeScript really for one reason. I mean, like Flow and TypeScript did roughly the same thing. We knew that we didn't want vanilla JavaScript because we needed a runtime guarantee. We needed to make sure that a typo wouldn't cause the application to crash for users. Objective-C is a compiled language. Swift is a compiled language. It made sense to use a compiled language in React Native as well for us. We went with TypeScript really only because the compiler was written in TypeScript itself. We wanted to be able to make changes to our tools. And if we went with Flow, we would have to learn OCaml, which is this functional programming language that we didn't really understand. And we went with TypeScript because we would be able to make contributions to the TypeScript compiler itself. And that's really the only reason. I mean, there might be some other reasons. Again, I wasn't really super paying attention at this point, but from what I've constructed after the fact, that's why we went with TypeScript. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep, great. I'm surprised about all. Thank you very much. Let's continue.
Let's do it. So shortly after we moved to React Native, or started building React Native, we did a team reorganization. We knew that the mobile team was going to start working in React Native. The web team was going to start working in React. We didn't want this division between web and mobile to exist anymore at all. At the same time, our web team had grown a lot. The mobile team grew as well. We were up to 5 mobile engineers. And what we did was dissolve the two teams and restructure them entirely. So instead of having a web team and a mobile team, we had several product teams. Product teams were responsible for a part of Artsy's business, basically. So I went to go work on the auctions team, and we built software to support Artsy's auction business. There were engineers on the partner success team that built software for our gallery partners to be successful. And the nice thing was that you had a mix of engineers. You had back-end, front-end web, and front-end mobile engineers all working on the same team, all doing their stand-ups together, planning and everything, along with a designer, a product manager, and a data analyst. and together they would work together to build a cohesive product. Um, so a couple things happened after this. Like we still use this basic structure. It has worked really well for us. And one of the most interesting things that happened from my perspective was not just the technology changes. We're now both using React, but the mobile team culture was. I'm biased because I was on the mobile team, but I think it was a little bit stronger maybe than the web team culture, or maybe that's how it felt to me at the time. But I saw a lot of the mobile team culture spread to the web team. So we really cared about things like open source by default. We really cared about automating our culture through tools like Danger. And that is now in the rest of Artsy engineering. That's no longer Artsy mobile culture. That's just Artsy culture. And I love that. I love that we managed to share the best of what made working at Artsy as a mobile engineer so much fun. So later that year, kind of around the beginning of 2017, we stopped building new software in Swift and Objective-C. We made the decision that new things would be written in React Native. And I was on the auctions team at the time, and I thought, fine, this doesn't really affect me. All my software is written in Swift. I'll just continue doing that and keep ignoring React Native. And we did continue building some new things in Objective-C, like augmented reality eventually. But that's because that was the best tool for the job. Again, we weren't going to sacrifice user experience for the sake of using React Native. So yeah, that's kind of a really pivotal point in the shift. So the next thing to happen was the adoption of GraphQL and Relay. GraphQL, like it's if you don't know what it is, it's kind of like for you to for the exact data that you need back. So you don't ask for like 5 different API calls from REST and then throw away half the data you get back. You ask for the specific shape of the data that you want, and you get back that same shape. So it's a lot less wasteful. There are fewer round trips to the network, and the responses themselves are smaller. So it's fantastic for mobile mobile and web apps. The GraphQL switch itself was driven by our developers. Our backend API was written in Rails, and the GraphQL server was really something that the front end engineers did for ourselves. We built this server, and basically you send it a GraphQL request, and then it figures out which REST calls it needs to make to our regular API, gets those responses, assembles them together, and gives you back the response that you asked for. So it's still using REST under the hood, but you don't really know about it. This is very similar. So what I mean is that like our platform team wasn't really incentivized to create the GraphQL server because REST was working fine for them. This was something that we felt a need on the front end, so we built it ourselves. At the same time that we adopted GraphQL, we adopted Relay. Relay is very similar to Apollo, which does basically the same thing, and I'll explain how it works in a second. But the pivotal thing to understand here is that we had moved our iOS team to use React Native. We moved our web team to use React, and now we were sort of on the same foundation together. And this was the first time that we both adopted a new tool together. So we had gotten to the point where we were using React, and now we're using something on top of React for the first time. And this is how Relay works. Let's take this auction view here on the side. So there are a couple things that the auction view needs in order to present data to the user. It needs the auction name. It needs to know when the auction closes, the banner image, and maybe we'll say that's one API call in a REST context. Next, it needs to know the user's registration status. Is the auction still open for registration? Maybe that's another API call. And finally, it needs a list of all of the lots in the auction. It needs to know, each lot needs to know its name, its artist name, maybe its current bid, number of bids, all that information. So maybe that's a third API call. So instead of making these 3 network round trips and assembling the data yourself in a model layer and presenting it to the user, Relay does all of this for you. You describe in the abstract, this is how I present an auction. This is the data that I need to present an auction. And Relay takes the data that you said you need, turns it into a GraphQL request, performs the request, gets the response, and then populates a React component tree for you with all the data. So there's no more explicit network layer. Each component has a model that is generated automatically specific to that component. So we don't have a model layer anymore that we need to worry about. Everything is generated based off the GraphQL schema and the data that the components say they need. So it's all type safe and it's all automatic. And I honestly love it. It makes building software really fun. The next big step for us was a conference that we ran with Facebook called Artsy x React Native. This was summer 2018 out of the Facebook office the Facebook office in London. They share their space, and presenters from both companies talked about how to build a really great application in React Native. And this was kind of when I realized, React Native isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. If I want to stay working at Artsy, I'm going to have to deal with it. And that's okay, because what happened next was that I started to change my mind about React Native. So I was on the auctions team, and we didn't have a lot of iOS software that we needed to build. The auctions business at Artsy needed someone to build features in our real-time bidding backend. And that was written in Scala. And my manager said, "Hey, Scala is kind of like Swift. Why don't you give it a shot?" And I did, and I built this new feature on the back end, and it was really fun. I started branching out from iOS, and then he said, "You've built the back end. Why don't you build the front end on the web in React?" And I said, "Sure. This sounds really fun." And it was like I learned React on the web before I learned React Native on iOS, and I loved it. It just seemed like such a intuitive way to build APIs. Like a declarative component tree made sense to me in a way that UI view controllers didn't. And I realized that the reason why we switched to React Native from a technological perspective was so that we could use React. Like React by itself was worth the switch. Um, Moving forward, um, we had a shared use of Relay and GraphQL. The next big thing that we did at Artsy was Palette. Um, Palette is the first time that we shared code between the website and the mobile application. And it's really where things started to accelerate. This was a real synthesis between our web colleagues and our mobile colleagues. They had been adopting React from Backbone. We had been adopting React Native from Objective-C. And this was the first time that we were sharing code. And the idea was that we wanted engineers to be able to move from web to iOS and start building app software really quickly. We wanted iOS engineers to be able to go to the web and start building web software really quickly. So what does this look like? Here we have an example of a very small component. This is the entity header component, and it's something that Palette defines. So on the left-hand side, you see the web implementation, and it has a follow link because links are what you do on the web. And on the right-hand side, it has a follow button because that's how interfaces on iOS work. We don't have links, we have buttons. So from the perspective of the programmer, you're using the same thing. It has like, even though these two components are different on web and iOS, because one of them has like a .ios file extension and the other one just has a regular .js extension, you're using the same API. Like the props are the same, the name is the same. If you were working on the web and you wanted to start building something in iOS, you could import this from Palette just like you were used to using, and it would use a lot of the same code. Like all of the typography, all of the labels, all the buttons are all pretty much identical across the two platforms now. So a web engineer could come to iOS and could start being productive really quickly. Okay. So next up in our timeline was just like a nice calm period of productivity. I've been talking a lot about change and about adopting new technologies, and we're already like over 2 years into our timeline here, and I really want to call out how this worked. Like React Native helped us be really productive. It helped get our teams more aligned. We saw tons of benefits from React Native. Teams were able to start building software with just a single or maybe no mobile engineers on their team. We've been making a lot of investments in infrastructure, and we saw those investments pay off here. The one thing that I will note is that what we would start to see here is a pattern where, like, say the purchase team was building a new piece of software. So I joined the purchase team in 2018 to help them build a new user interface for placing bids in auctions. Um, I would join, and then I would help them be productive in iOS. And then the project would finish, and I would move on to a different team, and I would switch teams and help them do something else in their team. Say it's the Discover team, and they want to build like a map view in React Native. So um, this was, I mean, like web engineers switch teams all the time too. We try to encourage this at Artsy. But the thing is that we only really had 1 or 2 teams at a time building software in React Native because there just weren't enough mobile engineers to support all of the features we wanted to build. So yeah, what do we do here? Well, Artsy Engineering actually runs skills surveys. Every 6 months, we send out an anonymous survey to our engineers and ask them, these are the different technologies that Artsy uses. How familiar are you with them? Like how comfortable do you feel working in them? And we also ask them, which of these technologies do you want to learn more of? And we found that there weren't very many engineers at Artsy who were that comfortable in React Native. A lot of the mobile team had moved on to other companies, so there was just a handful of us left, and we were sort of hopping between teams to help them. But there were lots of other engineers at Artsy who wanted to learn React Native because they weren't really comfortable with it, but they wanted to be more comfortable. So in 2019, after this period of doing like one major iOS project at a time with engineers moving between teams, we invested in training. I sat down and built out a sort of a course that you can follow. The URL is here on the slide. If you want to go check it out, we've open sourced our learning documentation. And this was helpful for 2 reasons. First, it filled in that skills survey gap where people wanted to build things in React Native, but they didn't really know how to yet. And second, it really helped me. I learn really well when I'm put in a position to teach others. That's the best way that I learn. If you want me to learn something, then you should tell me to teach it to someone else, because then I will learn it like the back of my hand and be ready to share my knowledge. And the thing was that I was one of the only mobile engineers left at Artsy from that original team of 5. And all of a sudden, that 2 years that I spent ignoring React Native, I had to understand decisions that were made during that time. I was responsible for maintaining this code that I really, at the time, didn't want anything to do with. So I had to learn a lot about our infrastructure in order to be effective at my job. So investing in training others was how I did that. I want to pause here for any other questions that we have from the chat. Is there anything, Vladimir?
Let's see. Well, no, unfortunately. I think this is perfectly clear. How well did the trainings went for you engineers? So how it was perceived?
Sure. The training went really well. We did a survey afterwards to see, like, of the, I think it was about 10 or 12 engineers who took the training. We asked, how do you feel before and after? Was this a valuable experience? And we received a lot of positive feedback. When I did the training, I really tried to emphasize how similar building applications in React Native was to building web software at Artsy in React, and I think that helped a lot. The parts that were difficult were a lot of the initial environment setup. Like these are engineers who maybe they've never even downloaded Xcode before, or if they did, they only did it so they could get to the rest of the developer tools. So they're opening Xcode for the first time and starting the React Native packager and trying to be productive. And that initial setup was kind of difficult. But after that, I took them through the process of building their first view in React Native. So like subclassing our component view controller in Objective-C and then hooking that up into the React side of things, and then go from there. So the training went really well, and that's not just me saying it. That's I have got a survey to back it up. So I think it went really well, and the people who took it did as well.
That's
Yeah.
great because because typically native developers are kind of skeptical about this React Native thing because new tooling, new everywhere, everything. So yeah, but I'm glad to hear that that was perceived well. So yeah, that's great.
Thanks. I will
Okay,
clarify
let's
one thing
continue.
too. Just to clarify in the training, like at this point, I was one of the only like native engineers left at Artsy. There were some web engineers who had done Objective C, and we'll talk about them in a second. But the training was really meant for the web team, like the web engineers who were used to React and wanted to start building things in React Native, and that's where it was really successful. Okay, so let's move on to the next step, which was to create a mobile experience team. I was on vacation in August, and when I came back, I saw this wonderful email in my inbox from our VP of software. He said, we really need to create like a mobile experience team, and laid out the reasons why. And he asked me if I wanted to be the tech lead, and I was so excited because um, there's this concept called Conway's Law. You can look it up. I recommend you do, actually. It's very insightful. It says that when an organization builds a product, say a software product, the organization can only build a product that is a mirror of its organizational structure. So back when Artsy was made up of two teams, the web and iOS team, we built a product that was very clearly divided between the web and iOS. It was the web team, the iOS team playing catch up, and falling back to the web team where we had to. When we did the reorganization in 2016, we switched to several product teams. We had auctions, we had discover, we had purchase. And what we ended up having in the application was an auctions application and a purchase application and a discover application. It's kind of like siloed there. So each piece of the application worked well on its own, but as a whole, they didn't really feel very good. The holistic experience had degraded, and I have to emphasize at this point that this is not React Native's fault. This is something that we did because of how we organized ourselves and our prioritization. We created this problem, and it would have happened whether or not we adopted React Native. And so we had this this application that was falling in the App Store rankings over time. Users would sort of notice, obviously, that the application wasn't as good as they wanted it to be, as good as we wanted it to be, and yeah, so we wanted to create a mobile experience team to address this, to make the application a really fantastic user experience. So we created the mobile experience team. It was pretty lean at the time. We only had a half-time designer and product manager, and it was just 3 engineers, including me, the tech lead. And yeah, we did it though. I mean, we had like I was pretty well versed in Objective-C and Swift. Another one of our team members was pretty well versed in Objective-C and React Native, and the other one was a web engineer who had learned React Native while at Artsy. And we created the team together in order to look for opportunities to make the application better. So that looked like we would grab user sessions from our analytics and just actually go through the sessions, say like, okay, how are users using the application, and what are the parts that we can make it better. So one example, our search interface was still written in Objective-C, and search doesn't fall into any of our categories. It's not purchase, it's not discover, well, it kind of is, but it fell between the cracks. And so one of the first things we did was rewrite the search interface in React Native in order to iterate on it, because it's in Objective-C. No one knows Objective-C. Let's put it in a programming language that everyone at Artsy can contribute to. And we did that. One of the first features we added was to access your recent searches. This was something that we had never had before, but we saw that users would go back and search for the same artist, like several times in the same session. They would go and they would look up Andy Warhol, for example, and then they would tap on the search result. They would go do some stuff. They go back to the search tab. They type in Andy Warhol again and go through the same process. So we took a look at the application user experience at a very high level and started to make investments in it, and it went really well. The next thing we did was to not just make it better for users, but also better for other developers at Artsy. We had Emission and Eigen separated still. And the reason we did that originally, if you recall, was because we didn't want the native engineers to have to know about JavaScript. And the thing was, there were no more native engineers. Everyone who knew Objective-C at Artsy also knew React Native. And having the two repositories separated actually introduced a ton of friction. So as more and more development was happening in Emission, Emission itself was becoming a bottleneck. We would have to release a new version of it. That would take 10 minutes. We automated it on continuous integration servers, but it would take time and effort and thought. And yeah, we just decided, no more. We're going to combine the two. And now all of our JavaScript and all of our Objective-C and Swift live in the same library, the same repository. This is an ongoing process. We're by no means finished, and we've got a lot of ideas to get there. Something I'll point out here is that when we started building in React Native in 2016, there weren't a lot of resources like to follow. There weren't a lot of tutorials. Some of the questions that we had, we were the first people asking those questions. A lot of the problems that we ran into, we were the first people running into those problems. In 2020, that's no longer the case. The community has been around long enough to establish best practices and to have a lot of really great ways of building software that we're catching up to now. So our goal is to make it so that our application looks and feels like any other React Native application from a developer's perspective, and that's still an ongoing process. Something else really extraordinary happened. We have 5 teams right now building iOS software. The same separated product teams, auctions, purchase. They're all doing something different in the application at the same time. And we couldn't have done that a year ago because we didn't have the training and the expertise. We didn't have the technology set up to support this. But through the process of starting the mobile experience team, of addressing user experience needs and developer experience needs, we've gotten to the point where Artsy has started adopting a mobile-first product strategy, where the web is now catching up to the iOS application. And that's amazing. The mobile experience team started as this team that was building user-facing features, but as time goes on, we're playing more of a supporting role. We feel like a platform team where we are making infrastructure improvements and upgrades, and we're still learning how to balance that with product work. But yeah, this is a huge change from having just one, maybe two teams working on the application at the same time. And that makes me pretty happy. When I think back to when I joined Artsy 6.5 years ago, the mobile and the web teams were so separated, siloed, using different tools and languages. We honestly didn't even interact that much. So we were like 2 teams within one company. And I think that's pretty common at companies that have iOS teams, is that the iOS team, maybe the Android team, and the web team, they don't really talk. They don't interact as much as they do amongst themselves. They don't share tooling. They don't share languages. They don't share a culture, and that makes it hard to have like a really cohesive workplace. So when I compare where we were and where we are now, I am like super happy, and I feel really glad that I've been able to have this change at Artsy. So moving on, we hit a milestone last month that our app ranking hit 4.7. This took a lot of time and a lot of work. When we started the mobile experience team in September 2019, our app ranking was less than 4. I'll put it that way. We thought about what we wanted to do and how we wanted to improve our app ranking. So our hypothesis was that if we made a better application and then we asked users to rate the application, then our app ranking would improve. And it sounds kind of basic, but I mean, it worked. We spent a few months making improvements to the search interface, to galleries, to like the holistic experience of the application, improving things like performance and making it feel more like a native application. And then we adopted the iOS 12 in-app ratings API. So before, we would ask users to rate the app and kick them out to the App Store to do it. And we adopted the new iOS SDK, where the users can just hit 5 stars right in the application. And we started doing that. And you can see pretty much when we started doing that, which was at the end of the year, when the number of 5-star ratings started to go up. So our hypothesis that if we built a better application and then we asked users to rate it, that they would rate it well, turned out to be true. It seems obvious, but I thought I would share that with you. Okay, so that is the timeline. You can see early 2016, we added Swift, we added React Native, we did a reorganization, and then that reorganization didn't really support Swift, so we stopped Swift. We stopped building new features in Objective-C and Swift. At that point, we started adding tools on top of React and React Native so that both mobile and web engineers would be able to be productive in them. We started sharing tools with Relay, and then we started sharing code with Palette. And from 2018 to 2019, we saw rising productivity where mobile team members were able to contribute to web software and web engineers were able to contribute to iOS software. Over time, we lost our native experts, people who had been around for years writing Objective-C, and I was the only one left. And we also saw a desire for Artsy engineers to learn React Native and to contribute more to those projects. So we invested in training. We identified problems with our application user experience that were a result of how our organization was structured. Remember Conway's Law, we structured our organization in such a way, and the software we built ended up being a copy of that organizational structure. And so we created a mobile experience team to do that. We know, like Conway's Law, I have to emphasize, states that the only product that a team can build is a copy of its own structure. So we changed our team structure by creating a mobile experience team in order to change the product that we were building, and it worked. We combined the repositories to improve developer experience. We invested a lot in our user experience, and we saw an increase in the application or in the App Store ranking later on. So that's an overview of the timeline. The next section I'm going to go into talks about the lessons that we learned and trying to kind of synthesize some of those like higher level lessons and taking a look back at some of the mistakes we made and some of the things we did right and share them with you. So before we go on, I want to make sure that we're clear on the timeline. Vladimir, are there any questions from the chat about anything that I've discussed so far?
Up the talk itself and start answering the questions. Let's do it. How do you feel?
Can you repeat that?
Well, I said that if you're done with the talk and you're you're ready to transition to Q&A, let's do it.
No, I've got some more content. Don't worry. So yeah, let's go through
Okay.
the last section. Okay, so the lessons we learned. There are 6 lessons that I want to go over with you, and I'm going to go over them now, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail. So first, React Native is effective when you use it well. Second lesson, you still need native experts. Third, I want to talk about Incremental Revolution, which is one of Artsy Engineering's guiding principles. 4, how to use culture to drive tech decisions. 5, how you still need an empowered team in order to use React Native. And 6, talk about technical debt and cultural debt. So first, React Native. Like there are parts of our application that are just never going to be rewritten in React Native, either because it's too expensive to do so or because it just doesn't make sense. Like augmented reality, the APIs already exist in Objective-C and Swift. We already have an implementation. There's no value in moving it to React Native because Android is going to have its own augmented reality version anyway. We don't get any cross-platform benefits. So React Native is like a great solution to the problem we had. We have a nice user interface in front of our API, and that really fits. That description fits a lot of applications. So it's likely that React Native would help with them too. Even without an Android application, without the cross-platform support, React Native has been worthwhile for us. We adopted it because it was a better way to build apps, and it helped us build apps better. We adopted it because it was a way for us to change our engineering culture, and it helped us do that. There are some React Native gets a bad reputation for things like performance issues, but it's not like if your team cares about performance, then you'll write really great performing React Native code. If your team doesn't care about performance, then you can still write really bad Objective-C code. Whether or not your application performs well, whether or not it feels like an iOS application, has more to do with your team's priorities than it has to do with the technology itself. So the next thing, you're still going to need React Native, or you're going to need native experts. React Native by itself can get you 95% of the way to a really great application. If you want to get to 100%, you need someone who knows Objective-C, because there are parts of the React Native experience where you're going to have to use a native API. So make that decision. If you want to make a really great application like we did, like a really stellar user experience, then you're going to have native experts. On the other hand, if you're trying to get out an application that as quickly as possible or with the least amount of expense, if you're okay sacrificing 5% of user experience for React Native, then you can make that decision. That's totally up to you. We've tried to never sacrifice the user experience for the sake of using React Native, and I think we've done well there. Where we dropped the ball in terms of user experience has only been around how we organize ourselves. Native experts, they know the platform, they know the native APIs, they know what a real iOS app feels like, and they should be involved really early in the design process as well, because they'll know, well, this button should be over here, or this should be a modal, that kind of stuff. We have iOS experts. If we were going to build an Android application, we would hire an Android expert to help us do it in React Native. So the next thing I want to talk about is Incremental Revolution. I should have added a slide to our docs here, but we've got an open source README repo. You can go check this out. It's one of our guiding principles, and it's how Artsy Engineering approaches large changes. We could have rewritten our entire application in React Native from scratch. We could have done that, and that would have been like revolutionary. But that would have been a bad idea because rewrites are usually a bad idea. So instead, we isolated the changes and made small incremental steps towards a big change. It took several years for us to get to the point where most of our application is in React Native, but we did it with little steps along the way. This can be costly sometimes. We saw by isolating our React Native in one repository so that our native engineers didn't have to know about it. We didn't just separate the code, we separated the team. And that kind of sucked, right? It wasn't good to have a group of native engineers who didn't know about JavaScript and React Native and TypeScript. Big changes really require big rewards. We tried out Swift, we really did, and the reward that Swift gave us was really small in comparison to the reward that adopting React Native gave us. So we decided to go with React Native. Um, and the other thing I'll mention here is that we use spikes to validate ideas. So we might take a couple days or maybe a week and try something really big. Just one engineer working by themselves. So they'll try out React Native in a small project to see if it works well, and then share what they learned with the rest of the team. And those have worked out really well. The next thing, use culture to drive tech choices. Our hypothesis was that using React Native would help our web engineers build mobile software and help our mobile engineers build web software. That hypothesis was proven correct. We moved iOS development and web development to use the same technology, and then we built tools on top of that. Tools like Palette, Relay, TypeScript. I mean, almost every engineer at Artsy now uses Visual Studio Code, whereas before some of us were using Xcode, some of us were using Sublime, some of us were using Atom. Now we're all using the same tools, and Artsy has its own VS Code extension pack, so that day one a new engineer starts and they're already up to speed with all of the tools that they need to be productive writing software at Artsy. I think that's pretty cool. So this is what this looks like. So first, at the top, you decide what you want your culture to be. You know where you are, you decide where you want to go next. Second, you make technical decisions to support that culture. We wanted our web engineers and our iOS engineers to work together. So we moved them to use the same technology so that that culture would happen. And third, we see that the tech choices that you make influence your culture. So that's where we saw, an iOS engineer has an idea, and all of a sudden the web engineers are collaborating with them on it. Or the web engineers have this new tool called Renovate we use to update our dependencies. So now we're using Renovate on the iOS side as well. So yeah, decide on your culture, then make decisions to support that culture, and then see how that works out, and then go back to the first step. This is a cycle. You do it again and again. This framework really helps you think about technology decisions, not as events, but as ongoing processes. When you make a decision, you're not just making a decision in that moment, you're actually committing to a process of moving to that. So you need to think about that as a long-term kind of thing, where your technology influences your culture, which influences your technology. You can't make a cultural decision that isn't a technical decision, and you can't make a technical decision that isn't also a cultural decision. They are always, one and the same. Next, you need to check in over time. I mean, like, I have felt guilty at times that I went 2 years without checking in to see how React Native went at Artsy. That's not just my fault, though. I shouldn't have been allowed to ignore this huge transition at Artsy. The engineers who were pushing for React Native should have done a better job making sure that everyone was on board with those changes. Yeah. And I'll just leave you with one other thing, that the culture on your team is going to change over time, whether or not you want it to. So you may as well think about your culture and take control over it. Next up, you need an empowered team. This is kind of what I mentioned a second ago. Someone needs to socialize the technology. They need to train other engineers and encourage other engineers to use the technology. Someone needs to help them learn. Someone needs to keep your dependencies up to date. And you need institutional authority to do this. We left it up to a couple of engineers who would update to the latest version of React Native whenever they had a moment. It wasn't really prioritized as part of their main job. It was something that they did because they cared and because it was important to do. But I think it would be better if there was a team structure to do this, and that's what we have now with mobile experience. Someone needs to make sure that your app feels like a real application, that it's holistically a really good user experience. We said we would never sacrifice user experience for the sake of React Native, and we didn't. What we did was sacrifice the user experience for the sake of our organizational structure. So you need an empowered team if you want to have a really great platform. If you're not returning to helping others learn about this. My coworker John has this saying he likes to repeat. He says that in order to explain correctly, you need to explain over and over. So basically, if you're not explaining over and over again, then you're not explaining correctly. And I wish that Native at Artsy had repeated to me why we were doing that a few more times. I think I would have been a little bit more open-minded to it as time went forward. So moving on to the final lesson, technical and cultural debt. We now have 7-year-old Objective-C code, and it's still running in the application, and it is a source of technical debt, but is also a source of cultural debt because we don't have very many Objective-C engineers anymore. So what we need to do is, in order to address this technical and cultural debt, is to convert a lot of that into TypeScript. Things like our router should be moved into TypeScript next. I need to remind you that technical and cultural decisions aren't separated. They're one and the same. Technical and cultural debt is the same way. You can't think of technical debt without thinking of cultural debt as well. Our technical debt is that no one knows how to maintain this Objective-C code. That's also a cultural debt. The teams that have to go into that, if a team needs to make a change and they need to change some Objective-C in order to make a new feature, then right now they're slowed down by that, and that's both a technical and a cultural thing. So yeah, what is next for React Native at Artsy? Well, we're going to be we're going to be consolidating more of our code, migrating things that are in Objective-C into TypeScript, especially the shared infrastructure. Right now, our application uses a tab bar at the bottom. The tab bar is still in Objective-C. All the navigation, the routing is still in Objective-C. All of that needs to move over to TypeScript and React Native because we're getting ready for Android. This is continuing Artsy's shift towards a mobile-first product strategy, and we're going to be building out more and more tools that help our team be productive, not just in iOS software, but also in Android. So I want to leave you with something. There's this wonderful expression I learned in French that translates to understand is to forgive. I didn't understand React Native when we adopted it in 2016, and it wasn't until I understood React that I really understood React Native and that I started having an open mind. I hope that by going over the past 4.5 years of history at Artsy, I've given you a sense of why React Native might make sense for you. And even if you still don't like React Native, I hope that at least you understand it, and hopefully you might even be able to forgive it. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Talk, Ash. Thank you very much. So that's great, and we have a lot of questions about the culture itself and React Native in particular. So let's start with if you were making the decision about the application today, imagine you're doing it from scratch. So what decision would you make? Would you go with React Native nowadays in 2020?
I would. It would obviously, the answer is that it depends on what the application is, of course. If I were building an application that was going to make heavy use of machine learning or augmented reality or any of the other low-level APIs, like the hardware APIs on the iPhone, I would probably pick Swift UI because I like to learn new things, and Swift UI is a new thing. But Swift UI is basically just a version of React Native anyway that Apple made in Swift. So it would be fun to compare and contrast. But if all I were doing, if the application was mainly accessing an API and showing information from that API in a user interface, I would pick React Native for sure.
Okay, so you would still React Native. Okay, then. So, well, Artsy chosen to go with React Native and stick to this decision. However, not each of the companies that were using this decided to continue. For example, Airbnb abandoned React Native a couple of years ago. So, what do you think about that decision?
That's a pretty great question, actually. I remember when that happened. I wrote a blog post about this decision at Airbnb. And as you can guess from the content of my talk, I described the decision as a cultural decision, not a technical decision. So Airbnb, like you can read the blog posts where they describe how they adopted React Native and all of the Swift and Objective-C developers were really angry about it and how they stayed angry about it for months, how there was a division between the teams and how that division made everyone unhappy and how the native engineers just didn't want it. Like Airbnb was really big. Like they had I think at least a dozen or 2 dozen mobile engineers when they adopted React Native, and it's hard to make big changes when you have a big team already. Artsy only had 5 people, and you saw how difficult it was for us to make a change to React Native. Airbnb had an even bigger team, so it makes sense that the decision was more difficult for them. And again, their decision to abandon React Native was motivated. I mean, like it's motivated by technical reasons as well, and the blog posts that they published go into a lot of detail about that. But the blog posts also go into the cultural reasons why they abandoned React Native. So that, to me, that's like further evidence that my hypothesis that technical and cultural decisions are intrinsically related to each other, that you can't make a technical decision without making a cultural decision, and vice versa, is true. So I really respect Airbnb. I respected their decision because listen, like their engineers were unhappy with React Native. Don't use it then. Like you don't have to. I'm not going to force you to use the technology that I think is better just because that's my opinion. And I respect them for being so open about this decision. They could have just done this and hid it away and pretended like it never happened. That would have probably saved some embarrassment and some hurt feelings. But they shared what they learned through the process with the rest of the world, and I can't fault them for that at all.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to sum it up a little bit. So am I right? Is that the main takeaway from your experience is like pick the productive tool for your engineers as long as the technology provides desirable UX. Is that correct?
Can you repeat that again?
Sure. So the takeaway should be pick the most productive tool for your engineer as long as it provides the desirable user experience.
I don't know if I would say that. I think it's close, but what I would say is rather than pick the most productive tool, I would say think about the culture that you want to build on your engineering team and then pick the tool that supports that culture the best. If your culture is really into like low level performance gains, maybe Objective C would be better for you than even Swift because you can still write assembly in your iOS applications if you want to. Like, whatever culture you want, pick the technology that suits your culture.
Okay. Okay. So culture most important. Okay. Um, so as long as it is important, but what if a regular developer feels that the company has a cultural problem? I'm not sure which one in particular, but for example, miscommunication or not aligning the goals, and so it hurts the product. So how you can fix it from the developer perspective, not the management one?
That's a really big question. I've actually given a talk on this as well, called "Building Better Software by Building Better Teams." And the problem is that individual contributors, like individual developers, don't have a lot of power when it comes to making changes to problems like this. Like if there's a problem communicating, that sucks because the way to fix that is by communicating, but that's the thing you have a problem with, right? So it can be really frustrating if you're an individual developer who is, they see a problem, they want to fix it, or they see an opportunity and they want to pursue it, but they can't because of the culture. So I advocate for talking to your manager, explaining why you want to do something, why something is a problem, and communicating through that. I look at communication as a problem-solving tool. I think that many problems, not all problems, but many problems can be solved through communication and through effective communication. So if your company is making decisions because the priorities that the company has are wrong from your perspective, then talk about it. Like, why are they wrong? Describe the problems that you have with the priorities. Describe how it's affecting the things that the company, like maybe the company is unaware that it's prioritizing things incorrectly and you can help them understand. Or maybe there's something that you don't understand about the company's priorities, and then you can make a decision if you want to still work at that company. Yeah, if you have a problem, try to find someone who will listen to you. Maybe it's your man. Hopefully, it's your manager. Maybe it's another engineer. Talk it through. Make sure you understand things. Identify the parts where you don't understand, and then try to fill in those gaps.
Okay, great. So I think we have roughly a minute left. So, folks, if you have any more questions to Ash, we're going to switch to a discussion zone in a minute. So you should have received to the Zoom, so to the discussion zone essentially. So, Ash, thank you very much for a great talk. So I learned a lot from this. So yeah, very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I will switch in and say that yes, it's time to go to the discussion zone, but I want to thank you for the talk also, because it was very interesting for me to listen it even just as a MC. And it's a pity for me that I can't go to the discussion zone with you, that I have a track to go, because I have some questions. For instance, we don't have time for you to answer it, but maybe you'll answer it in the discussion zone for the people who will be there. You mentioned that open source as default is a part of good culture, and I'm curious, would you recommend it for most companies? Because a lot of companies are afraid of that. So I'll leave you with that, and you'll go to discussion zone, and if you'll answer it there, I'll ask Vladimir later, what did you answer? So
That's good.
thank you again for the talk.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. See you in discussion zone.